evening class. For today's lecture, we'll be learning about inflation and budget. So, from the perspective of CDS and NDA exams, inflation plays a huge role. From the economics syllabus, questions are often repeated from the inflation part. So, we will be studying about it. We'll be learning about the definition. We'll be learning, is inflation good or is inflation bad? We'll be learning about the various types of inflation. We will also learn how inflation affects an economy. We will be learning about the budget, about capital receipts, revenue receipts, expenditure of capital expenditure, revenue expenditure. So let me start this class by asking you a question, a very simple question. Is inflation good or is inflation bad for society or perhaps an economy? So think about it. So like many things in this world, I would like to say that even inflation is a double-edged sword. It has its benefits and its demerits. For example, inflation is good for an economy up to an extent. From 3 to 6% of inflation is required. That is the optimal percent for an economy to grow. Now, like, you might ask me, how is inflation good? So, what happens is, what is the core principle of inflation? Inflation is the rising of prices. So, why prices rise? Because there is a less of supply. So, what happens? So, when during inflation, when price is high, supply is low, what does the merchants or the owners do? They employ people so that production increases. Thus, because of inflation, employment increases. So that's a good thing. Now, how is it bad? Suppose inflation is at a level of 10 to 15%. That is a high prices. In that situation, what happens is people want to buy stuff, but they cannot afford to. Also, merchants cannot afford to pay wages. At that point, inflation is really bad because people have money, but there is no value of their currency or of their money. So let me start this lecture by talking about, is inflation good or what is the definition of inflation? So here we can see inflation definition: a persistent rise in the general price or level of goods and services over time is defined as inflation. Rate of inflation formula. So rate of inflation is price currently minus price previously divided by the previous price, which is multiplied into 100. Now we come on to the base effect. So what is the base effect? It is a statistical distortion. A low or high reference point in the previous year can make the current inflation rate look artificially high or low. Now we will see the causes of inflation. Basically, we have three causes. They are demand pull, cost push, and structural. So what is the demand pull? So demand pull is very simple. Basically, it's a supply and demand. If supply is high, demand is low. If demand is high, supply is low, right? Then we have cost push. Suppose I like to say this with an example of Parle-G biscuits, right? If the price of wheat increases, the price of biscuit will definitely increase. So that is the cost push. That is raw materials price increase, the final product price increases. Lastly, we have structural. So what is structural? Structural is inflation due to any other factor such as logistical issue, such as shipping issue, anything of that sort. Now we come on to the inflation spectrum and impact. So the inflation thermometer. So as I said before, inflation to a point is important and crucial for the proper working of the economy. So that is creeping inflation, creeping or 3% is optimum or good for growth of an economy. Then we have walking or trotting. It is 3 to 10%. It is a warning sign. It's neither bad nor good. It's just a warning sign that things should get under control. Then we have running, which is 10 to 20%. It says high risk. Then we have hyperinflation, which is under 50% per month, over 50% a month. That is currency collapses. For example, Zimbabwe. We have creeping, walking, trotting, running, and hyperinflation. Now let us look at the types of inflation. We have shrinkflation, that is reducing product size versus the same price. We have skewflation, price rise in single few commodities. We have stagflation, which is a summation of inflation, recession, and unemployment. So let me tell you an example of shrinkflation, or what is shrinkflation. The easiest way to understand it is by taking the example of Lay's chips. Back in the old days, in Lay's 10 rupees of chips, you used to get proper chips. But nowadays, क्या होता है? आपको हवा ज़रा मिलता है chips से. So that is your shrinkflation. The price remains same, but the product is less. So that is your shrinkflation. Then skewflation is price rise in only a few commodities. Stagflation happens because of inflation plus recession plus unemployment. Then we have deflation and disinflation. So what is the difference between disinflation and deflation? In simple terms, deflation means a reduction in inflation. That is, if inflation was 20% and it falls to 30%, if it falls to 10% or 5%, that is a deflation. Whereas in disinflation, there is inflation. Inflation keeps on rising, but the rate of inflation falls. For example, if this year inflation is at 30% and next year inflation rises at 31% and the next year rises inflation at 31.2%. So we can see it rose 1%, then 0.2%, right? So that is your disinflation. Next we have headline inflation and core inflation. So what is headline inflation? So headline inflation includes food and fuel, and core inflation is everything minus food and fuel. Now we will learn about the controlling measures for inflation, or how inflation could be controlled in an economy. So we have 3 points for this. Basically through monetary policies, through fiscal policies, and through administrative policies. Now what is monetary policy? So monetary policy is contractionary or expansionary. What happens is, suppose inflation is high in an economy, what the banks will do is they will increase their rate of interest. What happens is, people will be then will be depositing their money in the banks, and thus economy will, and then thus inflation will reduce. Suppose now there is a deflation situation where there is no one is buying anything, nothing is happening. The banks will reduce their income rate. Then people will take loans. Through that, they will start up businesses, they will spend money, and their economy will rise. So that is your expansionary and contractionary policy of monetary RBI, right? Secondly, we have fiscal of government. The governments either increase or decrease the direct tax for as per the inflation rate. Thirdly, we have administrative, banning exports. So what happens is, the government bans exports or they start hoarding up so that the necessities of its citizens are met. Finally, we have the union budget. So in union budget, we have revenue budget and capital budget. In revenue budget, we have to remember is neither the assets nor the liabilities are affected. Whereas in capital budget, assets and liabilities are for sure affected, right? So how that happens? In capital budget, the receipts are borrowings and debt. Receipts should be something which is earned, right? Even here, borrowings and debt, you have to pay interest to it. That's why in capital receipts, it is a liability. And the expenditure will be infrastructure, machinery, and loans. Whereas in revenue budget, we see receipts are tax or non-tax. Thus, it stays with the government. They can spend as per their requirements. In the expenditure, we have salaries, pensions, subsidies, and interest payments. Again, to tell you, capital budget, liabilities and assets are affected. In revenue budget, liabilities and assets are not affected. Now we come on to some of the formulas. This is very important. It gets regularly asked in your CDS and NDA exams. That is your fiscal deficit. Total expenditure minus total receipts. Revenue deficit. Revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. Primary deficit. Fiscal deficit minus interest payment. So this is very, very important. It gets asked every time from economics. Fiscal deficit is total expenditure minus total receipts. Revenue deficit is revenue expenditure minus revenue receipt, and primary deficit is fiscal deficit minus interest payment. So with this, we have come to an end of our short lecture on inflation. We have learned what is inflation good or bad, how inflation affects a society, what causes inflation, what are the types of inflation, what is budget, what is revenue budget, what is capital budget, what is revenue receipt, what is capital receipt, which one affects assets and liabilities, which one doesn't. So all these are gets asked in the exam frequently, and these are recurring questions. I hope you have understood. Thank you.